And now we did use some of the Utrecht University carbon allowance to actually bring in a very special guest from Accra, Ghana, Dr. Fatima Denton. She's the Prince Claus Chair on Equity and Development at Utrecht University, focused on just transitions. She's also at the United Nations University Institute for Natural Resources in Africa, based in Accra, Ghana. And all of you probably know that she's an intergovernmental panel on climate change expert focused on climate and land. But what you might not know is that a few years ago, she became one of the key leads at the intergovernmental regional bodies on climate change. That really started in the 2050s and a little bit earlier as well. So over to you, Dr. Fatima Denton. Take us on a journey of what you see happened in the transition 20s. Welcome.
Thanks a lot, Vanessa. So we're in 2060 and because it's a lot easier. Okay, so I too wish that we stayed with that poem and the song to some extent. I'm sure my kids would be taking out the scorecards and evaluating me on things that I said right or got wrong in 2060. Couple of things that I think is going to be essential in terms of where we are today. Let's start with the present. We want to call that present or dystopia, the past as a prologue, and a reimagined future. So that's my trajectory where I'm headed. In terms of a direction of travel, just to get a sense of what sort of bold transformation have we taken now in 2060, what have we missed along the way, and what are some of the changes that we need to make. There's been a few things that might sound a bit redundant with Louis's presentation, but I'll mention some things that we are celebrating. The Paris Agreement. It's not a big deal now, so that's something we're celebrating. I think perhaps in every household, they know what the Paris Agreement means. We have seen a huge reduction of CO2 emissions, so that's also not a big deal. We've reduced many of the carbon-intensive sectors, carbon-intensive industries that we've seen. So we're producing in a way that is not as polluting as previously, so that's a huge deal. Some of the countries in Africa, for instance, that have been very much a poster child of poverty, Ethiopia is an example, are now major producers of wheat, so they're no longer depending on Ukraine or Russia for their wheat. And then the technologies as well, lithium-ion batteries. These are produced in Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe has become the leading producer. And renewable energy, it's not a thing of the past anymore. I mean, not something that's a big innovation. It's something that we all have in our houses and etc. So these are things that we can celebrate. Geopolitically, 2060, the war's over. The PAD dependency that has been very much part of Africa's story, that's no longer the case. We're not on that sort of extractive pathway anymore, where we're so dependent on our natural resources. And again, as I said, there are some front runners, there are front movers. Namibia, South Africa, Zimbabwe, they've become the big leading countries in terms of their production of renewable energy. We have something called the African Continental Free Trade, and that's now become the biggest market. It is already the biggest market, but it's become even bigger. So that's the market where all our regional value chains will go through. They're producing all the different types of renewable energy sources, and that's now become more of a normal thing. And of course, this whole debate about hydrogen and a fuel of the future, it's now in use, and we have been able to find some solutions also to some of the problems related to hydrogen. What haven't we got right? What are some of the things that we haven't got right? Well, for starters, we have been very, very obsessed and very fixated about science. We've seen science almost as an exceptionalism, that science would solve all our problems. To a large extent, our biophysical references, I was sat next to the dean, our biophysical, the biophysical world, that has been our reference point. We point to the biophysics. We don't talk much about the social vulnerability. Some things like culture, like society, they've been more or less invisible because we've been so, as I said, so fixated on our science, on our IPCC, on our adaptation, mitigation, etc. And we simply haven't got the tools. We haven't found the tools on how we get some of the how do we extract the richness of the indigenous knowledge? How do we attract that? How do we extract that and make good use of it? So we haven't been able to do that. We haven't secured it. We haven't banked it. And to a large extent, the scientific knowledge that has been, some sort of a knowledge that sits up there, somewhat hierarchical, looking down at us, that has been something that hasn't really favored us in terms of where we are. And we haven't been able to embed climate change in our lives, in our societies. That's been a bit of a problem. So some of the blind spots, some of the things that we've missed, well, to a large extent, this whole climate thing has been a bit about power, a lot about power, I should say. There's been a lot around power asymmetries, and this has sort of created a huge blind spot. We haven't seen it. The interest, entrenched interest, multi-national companies, et cetera, I wouldn't name them all, but in a sense, we feel that communities have been disempowered. They haven't had the roles that they had in the past. So that has been a huge problem. And the global has taken over. So some of the things that communities could do nationally within their spaces, they're not able to do because of the fact that the global is the usurper has completely taken over. And it's a case of the tail wagging the dog. More or less, I think our way of arriving at net zero, some of the ethics that would enable net zero, we haven't actually followed some of those ethics. The plurality of voices, the fact that we need to hear voices, we need agency, those things haven't been as manifest as they should have been. And we've reduced those spaces. Some of these things that were done in the past where communities have found a way out of managing their own crisis. You take the example of Western Zambia, Kumboka, which literally means getting out of water. Communities were able to, with their hierarchical structures, they were able to manage floods. They would get out of the floodplains because they saw that as something's happened. Okay. They were able to manage these crises, this environmental crisis, by getting out of the way. And this was orchestrated and done in a way that symbolizes their life, their culture. And it worked. And what we have now is that those things have not been taken into account in terms of our climate management. And as I said, the global has taken over. And what was known in Western Zambia as the land, Western Zambia was called by David Livingstone as the land of milk and honey, now is one of the poorest parts of Zambia because they live on handouts and, I'd say, imported goods, imported food. But it used to be a very rich place. So those things that we had relied on, that knowledge that we had, that way of managing our systems, those things are no more. you take the example of the Nganyi people. I mean, this has a happy ending because they have learned ways of how they could use their resources. They've calibrated, the Nganyi people are basically rainmakers. They've been able to understand through a certain set of indicators how to predict what kind of weather patterns they will have. And that prediction has actually helped. They've been able to calibrate their knowledge with metadata. So the meteorological people in Kenya have been able to come up with their data, and that calibration has given them roughly around 95% accuracy in terms of agricultural productivity. And that has been really successful. So that knowledge has been preserved. And we need more examples like that, how indigenous can interface with scientific data. The case of the Gambia, again, a community that were basically troubled by the intrusion of saline water to the extent that they were not able to practice the production of rice anymore. And they had to move to salt mining. So this was something that really affected their growth, really affected their production systems, et cetera, et cetera. And you know, the loss in terms of culture is something that we need to take into account, because we call it non-economic losses, but to some extent, cultural losses means that they were not able to valorize or culture to the extent possible. So what's happening? If we want to reimagine a different future, we need to also say that science is not enough. As important as it is, science has to interface with society. It's science for humanity. So how do we ensure that we're localizing solutions? Because in a nutshell, that hasn't been done. That localization of society, of solutions, where we would be extracting solutions from lived experiences, where people are, not importing them. And the governance also has been a bit of a shrinking space. We have lost those hierarchies, those structures, and everything has been more or less on the global side. So these are things we need to take into account, that adaptation is a process. These are things we now know, that culture, that diversity is fundamentally important. We need to have those things, power, justice. These are all aspects that we need to factor into our management system. And how we get that right? Well, we need to not think just in terms of binary terms, but we need to see climate change within a holistic picture. It's not a linear thing. We need to move away from thinking very restrictively, because the restrictive thinking doesn't allow us to see the wider picture. This whole thing has been very power-driven, power-laden, and we need to recognize that that hasn't really helped. So we need to find a justice element in that, how we get justice back. And it's about all the different forms of justice: procedural justice, distributive, restorative. All of these have to be taken into account to get it right. I'm not going to get into all of this because it would be a bit too long, go beyond the time. But we need to think about the different ways of getting justice back into the conversation. Some would talk about compensation in terms of restorative justice. Some would say, well, how do you then begin to recognize past harms, and how do you correct that? How do you then value societies and be a bit more inclusive? So these are things we need to get right. We're back again on 2060, and I think some of that has been mentioned by this in terms of movement of people. So we're now, in 2016, we've seen that there are over 200 million environmental refugees. What do we do with that? When people move, they lose their identity, they lose their culture. And that in itself is a loss. And we need to recognize that the more we have cultural loss, the more society becomes fragile. So these things happen. So we have to think about how we repair, how we reset, and how we retool. These are all fundamental in terms of where we want to go. But it's about an equilibrium, and it's about culture, power, and justice together. These are fine threads, but they have to be, woven in a way that is really intricate, and we need to find all these different levers of bringing this back. I wanted to end with a quote by Sheila Jasanoff, who I really love in terms of the things that she's written. She says that the gravest challenge for humanity is every bit of scientific insight and technological inventiveness about collective disposal. But our uses of science and technology properly enlightened. It is essential that we take account not only of what science knows, but also how science knows it, what it does not know, and how to compensate for our ignorance. So we need to get away from that absolutism, that certainty about science knows, and try to see how we embed other types of knowledge as well, especially in terms of indigenous knowledge. Thank you.